Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Shantae Stocks, and on behalf of the Center for Social Concern and the Professional Development Planning Committee for Homewood Student Affairs, we welcome you to Unapologetically Asian. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, Cori Dioquino. Cori Dioquino is a Filipino-American actor, producer, writer, and teaching artist based in Baltimore. She earned her associate's degree in music performance from Howard Community College and her bachelor's in theater studies from Towson University. Her acting credits include Daredevil, FBI, and New Amsterdam. Cori began her teaching career as an after-school theater teacher in 2010. During the 2015-2016 school year, she worked as a full-time theater resource teacher for a Baltimore City public school through Single Carrot Theater. She continued her work as an arts integration educator through Young Audiences of Maryland's Summer Arts and Learning Academy in the summer of 2016. In 2017, Cori received her certification as an arts integration specialist through the Teaching Artists Institute in Baltimore. She is also an experienced acting coach who works to empower BIPOC and immigrant actors through her LLC, Dioquino Acting Studio. BIPOC stands for, by the way, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Cori is an outspoken advocate for stronger Filipino, Filipina, and Asian Pacific Indigenous representation in American arts and entertainment. In 2018, she co-founded the Asian Pasifika Arts Collective, AAPI, in Baltimore. The arts organization mission is to use art of all platforms to ensure that the stories of Asian Americans and Pacific Indigenous Americans are seen, heard, and valued. In 2020, Cori helped launch the national campaign, Unapologetically Asian. The campaign, which was a collaboration between AAPI and the team behind the national movement, Racism is a Virus, was created as a response to the growing discrimination towards Asians as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. It aims to empower Asian and Asian American communities to change the conversation about belonging in America. And without further ado, I bring to you Cori Dioquino.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight. And thank you especially to Dr. Stocks and Mrs. Song at the Center for Social Concern for having me here. So when I was invited here by JHU Center for Social Concern and also the HSA Professional Development Committee to share my story, the opportunity when it came to me about a month ago, the conversation regarding anti-Asian discrimination was a little different. At the time, our communities were still begging for people to pay attention to the crimes, the media, politicians, law enforcement, and the conversation itself was still growing. The topic was still up for debate. A lot of people were asking, should we label these crimes as hate crimes? So when I started planning this webinar, I had a little bit of a different goal. My goal at the time was just to help our community be a little less invisible and to just talk about things that no one really ever talks about, like Asian identity in America and how complex it is, or dismantling the model minority myth, anger within the Asian community, because we don't really address anger or talk about anger. And then Atlanta happened last week, and the context for the webinar shifted kind of completely. And to be completely honest, I couldn't really touch planning for this webinar for days after the shooting happened. I was just sort of in this really weird space, just processing everything. And what once kind of felt like this really empowering thing that I was preparing for, all of a sudden felt really heavy. And I was filled kind of with this burden and a little bit of dread. Because even just the topic of Asian American history felt really triggering to me, because the whole reason why I was going to talk about it was to try and address how we got to where we are now. And even looking at Asian American history just filled me with a lot of sorrow and a lot of despair and a lot of frustration that I wasn't experiencing before Atlanta. And so since I'm talking about what happened in Atlanta, and also because there was a shooting earlier this week, I do want to just take a quick moment to just honor those who have been lost. I want to take just a moment of silence to honor both the victims in Atlanta and also in Boulder, Colorado. Thank you. So I started thinking a lot after Atlanta happened about why I should even do this and what the importance is. When Dr. Stocks and Mrs. Young asked me to be here, they said, we just want you to tell your story. And I really started to think about that, about the importance of telling our stories, especially as Asians and Asian Americans right now, because so often our stories get erased or brushed off to the side in favor of analyzing the motives of, a gunman, our attackers, or our murderers. And so we're oftentimes ignored. So for me, the context of this webinar has shifted. Instead of being here to educate or inform, or even to help make our communities a little more visible, because unfortunately right now, we're incredibly visible in the news and in the media. For me now, this webinar is about claiming back my power, claiming back who I am, and claiming back my own story as an Asian, as a Filipino, as an immigrant, and as an American. And I hope that in telling my story, I can empower other people in the Asian American community to tell their stories too, because our stories matter. And right now, especially, they need to be heard and they need to be shared. I am going to talk a little bit about history. I hope I can still share a little bit about American history, Asian American history in particular. I do want to say, before I get into everything, that I am not an expert on Asian American history or history as a whole. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian. In fact, I actually didn't start learning about Asian American history as a whole at all until I was an adult, because it wasn't something that was included in my education growing up in America. And I think a lot of people have that experience, especially Asian Americans. We don't actually learn anything about our own histories in America, and we have to self-educate. And so everything that I am going to share with you today is something that I've learned from somebody else, whether it's my parents or my grandparents, another historian, another Asian American educator who had to do the work that other people didn't want to do. Specifically, I'm going to be referencing a book that I suggest everybody get if you're interested in learning more about Asian American history. It's called The Making of Asian America by Erika Lee. It's basically my Bible for Asian American history. I always refer to it when I need to learn or relearn something, or just sort of remind myself a fact about Asian American history. And then the other one that I was reading a lot during my preparation for this is called The Myth of the Model Minority by Rosalind Chou. I'll also provide a list of resources. I've asked Dr. Stocks and also Mrs. Song if they could share the resources that I have pulled from for anybody who's interested. So hopefully you'll get all of that when this webinar is done. And for my Asian American community members, if you hear me say something that might be incorrect or not completely accurate, I invite you to say so in the Q&A at the end, because like everybody else, I am still learning about my own history as a Filipino immigrant here in America. And that's actually where I want to start my story. I am an immigrant. I immigrated when I was 4. And the one thing that you should know about me is that I hail from Pasay City, Philippines. I am from Makati. I'm very proud of that. I am very Filipino and a proud Pinay. Fun fact though, I did not know that I was Asian until I got to America. So yeah, I identified as Filipino when I immigrated. A lot of Asian immigrants actually relate to that. And it wasn't until I immigrated to America and people were like, oh, yo, by the way, you're Asian. And I was like, oh, thanks for telling me. I'll try my best. But yeah, I didn't realize that I was Asian until I got here. And it's something that we all go through because we usually identify as our individual nationality. So I was Filipino and I was very proud of that. And unlike some Asians, whenever people would ask me, where are you from? I wouldn't actually get offended by that because I'm not from here. I would say, I'm from the Philippines and I was born in Pasay and I was really proud of that. You know, at least for a while anyway, and I'll get more into that as we go on. But the terms Asian and Asian American, those are new for us when we come here. And so I really asked myself a lot over the last few years, what does it even mean to be Asian and Asian American? And so I started to do research. Just so you know, I had basically 3 major identity crises in my life. I'm not even 40 and I've already had 3 major identity crises. And I'm going to talk about all 3 of those as we continue. And the first one happened when I was really, really young, when I was starting to explore what it meant to be Asian American. So the term Asian American actually comes from America, and it was created by a group of graduate students at the University of California in Berkeley in 1968. Specifically, it was coined by Yuji Ichioka, who is a 2nd-generation Japanese American, and he eventually became a historian and a civil rights activist. And it was also coined by Emma G, who was a Japanese internment survivor. Now, the group was actually inspired by the Black Power movement and American Indian movement and a whole lot of other anti-war movements that were happening in the US at the time. And a first-year student at UC Berkeley, Vicky Wong, who was a part of the group at the time, she actually said that she was inspired by the Black Panthers, who encouraged her to start her own group. She said, I tried to join the Black Panther movement or the Black Panther Party in Oakland, and they told me you can't because you're not Black. So they told me, you should form your own group. And I thought, well, what is my group? Because at the time, before the term Asian American happened or was coined, a lot of Asians were like me. They identified as their own individual nationality. And so other collective names for Asians at the time that had happened included Oriental, Mongol, and I think we can all agree that those terms have very racist and colonial connotations. So the goal of this group in coming together was to come up with a name that could include all different groups of Asians under one umbrella. They wanted to create a collective identity. So they named their group the Asian American Political Alliance, or the AAPA. And this is believed to be the first public use of the term Asian American. And eventually they went on to form the Third World Liberation Front, which was created as a coalition between the AAPA and Black student union groups at San Francisco State University. So there were a lot of pros to creating this movement and creating this new collective identity called Asian American, right? So the first pro was that it allowed for unified mobilization. Founders saw this movement as a pan-Asian movement, and it was the first time that a political movement included Asians from different backgrounds under one common cause. It united activists of Asian descent in their fight for greater equality in the US, and it also enabled Asian activists to work with other activist groups like Black activists and Native American activists and Latinx activists. There were a couple of cons, though, that didn't really show themselves until after this collective identity had been created. The first con is that it inevitably kind of created this monolith, this Asian American monolith. And it allows non-Asians a lot of times to see us as one gigantic race rather than understand us as individual cultures, nationalities, and to respect us as, and for those differences, to respect us for those differences. The other con that happened that I'm pretty sure they probably didn't foresee happening was that sometimes, especially for immigrants like me when I was a kid, this term Asian American feels kind of ostracizing because we're Asian, but not American. So we might look like members of the community, but our experiences are really different. And for someone like me, it can cause an identity crisis. And so that's when my first big identity crisis happened, was when I was a kid, when I was 4. I immigrated here. I am what you might call a 1.5 generation immigrant. Now, I first heard about the term 1.5 generation only a couple of years ago, actually. I was kind of lamenting to a couple of Filipino American colleagues who are both 2nd generation. And I was kind of venting to them about how, well, I'm 1st generation technically, but I can't really relate to my parents on a lot of stuff because, well, I don't really have the same experiences that they did immigrating as adults. And more times than not, I relate to 2nd generation Filipinos, but my experiences are really different from them too, because I actually immigrated as a kid. And so my perspective of identity whether it's Filipino or American or both, it's kind of like a hybrid of both of those. And when they heard me kind of vent about that, they were like, oh, you're a 1.5. And I was like, what's a 1.5? So they explained it to me and I started looking it up, and the term really resonated with me. So the term 1.5 generation, when in regards to immigrants, it was coined again also in the 60s by a sociologist named Ruben Rambout. I hope I pronounced his name right. But so he was a sociology professor at UC Irvine. He was also a Cuban American who immigrated to the United States as a child. And he defined 1.5 generation immigrants as stuck in between cultures, as they are not quite first generation, but not quite second generation citizens. And so this term really resonated with me when I heard about it, because that's exactly how I felt. I felt like I was stuck in the middle. I wasn't first generation, I wasn't second generation. And the truth was, growing up, I really didn't have anyone to talk to about my experiences. And it didn't help that I was only child either growing up, because I also didn't have any siblings that I could go to who were going through something similar. So some of the experiences that I had that were very different from my classmates had a lot to do with immigration. And one of the things that I had to realize the hard way was, even with my Filipino and Asian friends, I was still the only immigrant among them. A lot of my friends actually were second generation. So I found that even with my Asian or Filipino friends, I was still struggling to find someone who could relate to me. One of the experiences that I had growing up that made it really difficult to relate to a lot of my friends was the fact that my father was still in the Philippines. So my father couldn't get a visa for 5 years. The US Embassy wouldn't give him a visa. So for 5 years, I didn't have a dad. It was just me and my mom. And so for 5 years, I was constantly explaining and re-explaining to people, my dad is in the Philippines, he can't get a visa. I don't know, but the US Embassy won't give him one. I don't really know what a US visa is or what a visa is at all. I just know that my dad doesn't have one. The US Embassy won't give it to him, and he needs one in order to come here. And so I was constantly having to explain this to people, and not even just kids, but also adults. And it was really frustrating and really exhausting. And it didn't occur to me until I was much older how much that experience shaped me, because so many people just didn't really have a lot of empathy or a lot of sympathy, and didn't have any understanding for where I was coming from or what my experiences were based off of. And actually, before I immigrated to the US, I actually didn't have my mom for 2 years. From the ages of 2 to 4, my mother was an OFW. She was working in America as a nurse, and she was sending home money to me and my dad, and we were still in the Philippines. So from the age of 2 to 4, I was with my dad in the Philippines. And from the age of 4 to 9, I was with my mom in America. So I just said the word OFW. For those of you who don't have any Filipino friends, or who never watched that particular episode of Anthony Bourdain, an OFW stands for Overseas Filipino Worker. Many Filipino families have at least one parent that live and work abroad. Some work as nurses and as teachers because of a few immigration legislations that were passed. My mother was a nurse, and that's how she was an OFW for a while. A lot work in the service industry, and also a lot of Filipinos work as caretakers. And so you'll see a lot of Filipino, some OFWs working as caretakers, taking care of other people's children and families, but then they never see their own. And a lot of these OFWs tend to be mistreated as well. But that's the reality of a lot of Filipinos, is that we're growing up without a parent because they're overseas working. From April to September of 2019, it was estimated that there are about 2.2 million OFWs in the world. And the money sent back by OFWs amounts to about $31 billion a year. And that's about 10% of the Philippines' GDP. So OFWs, that's a huge reality for a lot of Filipinos. It's very deeply embedded in Filipino culture and our economy. And to understand the history of Filipino immigration to the Americas, you really have to understand the history of Western imperialism in Asia. Specifically in the Philippines, the history of Western colonization started with Spain, thanks to Magellan. Excuse me. So, fun fact, when I was, this is kind of funny to me now. When I was in 5th grade, we started learning about Magellan. We started learning about colonization and colonialism. And when I told my mom that we were learning about Magellan, she got like super excited, like, oh, so you're learning about the Philippines. And I was like, no. And she looked at my history book and she read the portion about Magellan, and it was like, what, one paragraph about the Philippines. And she was so frustrated and disappointed. She looked at this history book and she was like, that's it? That's all I had to say? That's all you know? And I was like, yeah, why? And my mom sat me down on the couch and she explained to me what really happened in Magellan. I think in my history book, it said something like Magellan got involved in some tribal argument and was killed. And my mom was like, no, 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 no. That's not what happened, honey. This is what happened. So I'm paraphrasing history here because this is what I remember. So what my mom told me, and this is more or less true, Magellan was killed by an island chieftain named Lapu-Lapu. He is a national hero in the Philippines. If you ever go to the Philippines, you will see so many statues of Lapu-Lapu. They're huge. They're just this big. They're statues of this big indigenous Filipino tribal chieftain dressed in indigenous wear. And he's very, very formidable and it's pretty badass. But Lapu-Lapu is who killed Magellan. And basically Magellan came in and was like, hey, we claim you in the name of Spain. And they were like, yeah, no, that's not cool. You have to go back home. And then they got into a war. And Magellan also was trying to use some existing rivalries between tribes in the Philippines to try and get them to side with Spain a little bit. And so that's more or less what happened in the Philippines. Magellan was killed by Lapu-Lapu by a poison spear. And the cool thing is that we still have Magellan's body in the Philippines because the Spanish, when everything was said and done, were like, can we have his body back? And we were like, yeah, no, go home, please. But eventually the Spanish came back, unfortunately. But that is the story of Magellan and how he died in the Philippines. Now, not only did my mom tell me this story, more or less that way, I added a little bit of my own flavor. But she wrote out a report for me. And she was like, you're going to read this in front of your social studies class. And then she wrote a note to my teacher and said, you're going to give this note to your teacher. I have no idea what that note said. For all I know, she cursed her out. I don't think she did, but I don't know what she said. So I had to give this note to my teacher. And I had, excuse me, I had to read this report that my mom wrote for me in front of the class. And I was so nervous and I was so embarrassed. I was like, okay, here we go. And I ended up reading this report. And instead of my classmates teasing me and being like, that was lame, everyone was asking me questions. And even my teacher was asking me questions. And at the end of it, everyone was like, that was really cool, Cori. Thanks for sharing that. And I was so proud of my Filipino heritage. I was like, cool. I just like taught everyone something. That's really neat. And that was my first experience decolonizing anything in America. But I often think about that experience because it's really telling to me now as an adult that here I am, this 5th grade immigrant kid trying to teach other people something about Western history that Westerners aren't teaching their own kids. So I always thought that that was really interesting when I reflected on it as an adult. And what most people don't actually know in America is that Filipinos have been in the Americas for centuries. The first known Filipinos to set foot in North America actually arrived in around October 1597 on a ship called the Nuestra Señora de Buena Esperanza. And it sailed from Portuguese Macau as part of the Manila galleon trade. And it landed in what is now known as Morro Bay in Upper California. Now, Manila at the time was known as the Pearl of the Orient. It was the main stop in Southeast Asia for slave traders. And it was known as this beautiful city where East meets West, where old meets new. So it was the city where there was this fusion between Eastern and Western cultures. So it was called the Pearl of the Orient. So slave traders would take 2 routes to the Americas usually. So one, they would either just go from Europe and cross the Atlantic and end up on the Atlantic side of North America. And the other route that they would take is they would round the south of Africa, pick up some slaves along the way, and then they would stop in Asia, trade slaves, maybe pick up some Asian slaves because there were a lot of Asians that were also slaves. After stopping in Manila, they would cross over to the Pacific and go to the Pacific side of North America. And they would do some business, where once business was over, they would cross back over the Pacific, maybe this time with some Central and South Americans, and they would go back to the Philippines. And so a lot of people have told me, and we joke around a lot about it, my friends and I, that Filipinos have more in common with Latin Americans than we do with actual Asians. And there's a reason for that, because we were first colonized by the Spanish. And when all of the slave trading was happening at that time, there was a lot of cultural exchange happening between Filipinos and Central and South Americans. So you'll see a lot of those similarities in our cultures because of that shared history. So that's when Filipino migration first began. Was during that time of Spanish colonization. And because the Spanish, once they conquered the Philippine Islands, they basically all but destroyed our indigenous culture and practices, like they did with pretty much the natives in America and anything that they touched, right? They took our land, they destroyed our economy, our way of life, and then they forced us into either servitude, slavery, or migration. Now, in contemporary America, Filipinos migrated in about 4 waves, give or take. The first happened in the 1840s, and actually, the first known Asian settlement in America was also a Filipino settlement of men. They were called the Manila Men, and they worked as fishermen. They settled along the Louisiana coast and the Mississippi River. And what they were doing was that they were fishing and they were sending money and provisions back to their families in the Philippines. So already we have migration happening, and a form of OFW, if you will. The second wave happened in the early 20th century. So the Philippines became a US territory after the Spanish-American War. So after we were colonized by the Spanish, we were colonized by the Americans. And so because we became an American territory, we were exempt from the Immigration Act of 1917, and that barred other Asians from immigrating to the States. That ended when the Filipinos gained independence from America, and with the Philippines Independence Act of 1934, that restricted immigration to about 50 Filipino immigrants a year. Now, the third big wave of Filipino immigration happened after World War II. So a lot of you know the Philippines played a huge role in World War II. Well, maybe not a lot of you know, but the Philippines played a huge role in World War II. Most of the time, the only thing we really hear about regarding World War II is MacArthur's famous words, "I shall return," and the Bataan Death March, right? I'll get more into World War II a little bit later. But after World War II, Filipinos who had served on the American side were given the option to become US citizens. And on my family, my lolo's lolo, or my great-grandfather, he was actually a guerrilla who fought on the American side, and he was given honorary citizenship. He's a really kind of inspiring figure in my family. He eventually became the mayor of a town. So he's always been kind of like this figure of pride in my family. And I always thought it was kind of badass to be able to say that my Lolo was a guerrilla in World War II. So that was one way that Filipinos were able to immigrate after World War II. The other way was through the War Brides Act and the Fiancé Act. So Filipino war brides were allowed to immigrate to the US due to those two acts. And approximately 16,000 Filipinos entered the US in years following the war through these two acts. This, by the way, along with just the overall American and European military presence throughout Southeast Asia and Asia, such as in Vietnam or Korea, those are the types of things in history that has contributed to this long-standing toxic stereotype of Asian women as mail order brides and prostitutes. Because during war, a lot of families were forced into poverty. Their lands, their houses, their towns were devastated. And a lot of women were forced into prostitution, and not just by the Japanese. I know a lot of people like to talk about the Japanese comfort women, but they were also forced into prostitution by the Americans and the Europeans as well. And so when we talk about these different stereotypes that contribute to anti-Asian hate, we have to talk about where they come from, because they didn't just start here in America. They started abroad and they carried over into the States. They followed us. In 1946, also, the Loose Cellar Act gave the Philippines a quota of about 100 migrants a year. However, records do show that about 32,000 Filipinos immigrated between 1953 and 1965, despite that quota. Now, the fourth wave of migration happened as a result of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So that act actually ended all national quotas and provided an unlimited number of visas for family reunification. The Philippines became the largest source of legal immigration in the US from Asia, and a lot of Filipinos during this time migrated as professionals because of the shortage of qualified nurses. So from 1966 to 1991, at least 35,000 Filipino nurses immigrated to the United States. One of them was my mom. So my mom and I immigrated together to the US in 1988. I was 4. And then my father immigrated when I was 9, so 5 years later. And I'll never forget this. My mom told me the story of what happened when she tried to petition for visas for my father and I when she went back to the Philippines. She said that she went to the immigration office, petitioned for visas, and they only granted her one. And this guy said that supposedly they had reached their quota for Filipino immigrants in the United States, which I question now because of what I know. But when he only granted her one visa, my mom said, well, I can't move to the US without my husband. I have a daughter. I have to work. Who's going to take care of my daughter? And this immigration officer looked at her and said, they have daycares in America. So yeah, I think about that moment a lot, and this lack of empathy that we tend to have towards immigrants, and how hard it must have been for my parents to make that really hard decision. It was hard on me, but I do think about that a lot. And so, you know, that contributed a lot to my first identity crisis. I like to call it my too much, not enough phase, because I realized quickly as a kid that I had to assimilate. And that I'm no longer Filipino, I am Asian. So I wasn't even just trying to assimilate in America, I was trying to assimilate as an Asian in America. And one of the ways that I tried to assimilate was, you know, I can't speak Tagalog anymore. My mom told me the story. I don't remember the story at all. I don't remember doing this, but supposedly this happened. I believe her. Apparently, I came home from daycare and I told my mom, I don't want to speak Tagalog anymore. My American friends say that I'm in America and I can't speak it anymore. I can only speak English. Now, my mom is a really defiant woman. So in case any of y'all who know me were wondering where that came from her. But my mom heard this and she was like, yeah, no, I'm not listening to Americans. And she insisted, and she very adamantly spoke to me in Tagalog even more, which I'm sure I hated. But now as an adult, I realize how much of an advantage I have because of language. I'm still connected to my Filipino heritage. And sometimes when I talk to my Filipino friends and they say, well, my parents tried really hard not to speak to me in Tagalog because we were trying to assimilate, I can see that there's a little bit of regret and a little bit of sadness because it's a part of their heritage that they feel disconnected from. And so I'm very grateful that in that moment, my mom chose to be defiant and speak to me in Tagalog. So thanks, Mom. Growing up Filipino, a Filipino immigrant nonetheless in America, I kind of assumed that everyone who was Filipino or even Asian was like me, that they were immigrants. And I was like super surprised to find out that there were Filipinos and Asians that were born in America, and not just kids my age, but people my parents' age. And I was even more shocked when I got older and I realized that there are Filipino families that had been here for generations, like for 4th, 5th, 6th generations. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. And when I realized this, I had 2 thoughts. I had my first thought, which was, that's really cool that they were born here. And then my second thought was, well, I really wish that there was somebody else who was an immigrant, because I really wish there was someone I could talk to. So my too Filipino, not Asian enough phase is what I like to call it. I was experiencing a lot of things as an immigrant that my friends couldn't possibly understand. So one of the things that I experienced at a really young age was I had extreme separation anxiety for a short period. And the reason for that was because when I was about 6 or 7, my mom sat me down and went through emergency protocol. You know, this is what you're supposed to do if something happens to me. And she made it a point that I memorize this protocol, this procedure of what I'm supposed to do if something happens to her, because we were alone in America and I was an only child. So if something happened to her, I would be completely alone as an immigrant kid. So, you know, I memorized, this is the list of emergency contacts. I'm supposed to call Wendy, my mom's best friend. She's going to pick me up. She's going to take me to her house, and she's going to let me stay there until my godmother can come down from New Jersey and pick me up and take me to Canada, where my godfather is. And I'm going to stay there with Ninong Max until my Lola can come from Hong Kong. And then she's going to take me back to the Philippines so that I can be with my dad. And we drilled this every night for several days until I knew it by heart. And I also knew that the daycare had a list of these emergency contacts, and so did my school. And this is what's supposed to happen if something happens to my mom. And so, of course, whenever my mom dropped me off at daycare, I would start crying and screaming uncontrollably, just hyperventilating, because I was so scared that once my mom left, I was never going to see her again. And I was going to be home alone. And every time my mom went to pick me up at daycare, I was so terrified that I would never see her again. So if there was ever a day that she was running late, I would start to panic a little bit, because I was like, oh no, my mom's not coming to get me, something's happened. And of course, my friends would all kind of make fun of me, like, haha, Cori's such a loser. She's such a baby. She doesn't want to be away from her mommy. But they had no idea that what was really happening was I was terrified of losing the only person in America that I had, that was my family. And those were the kinds of things that I was experiencing growing up Asian in America that my friends couldn't possibly understand. I also had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't the right kind of Asian because I was Filipino. I remember looking at this globe when I was in first grade at my daycare, and I remember staring at the continent of Asia. And I was looking at China and how big it was, and I was looking at Japan, and I was looking at the Philippines. And I remember thinking to myself, I really wish I was either Chinese or Japanese. Like, I wish I was from China or Japan, because at least people know what those countries are. Whenever people hear that I'm from the Philippines, they don't believe me. They don't even know that that's a country. And I was really frustrated. And I think it's interesting looking back on that now to realize that I wasn't sitting there wishing to be white or American. I was sitting there wishing to be a different kind of Asian, because even then I knew I'm Asian, but I'm not the right kind. So I wasn't Asian enough. I wasn't the right kind of Asian. I wasn't American enough, but I also wasn't Filipino enough, because I was growing up in America. And so even though I'm first generation like my parents, my experience is really different because I'm a child immigrant. So as I got older, I became more and more American, or too American. I actually remember this one time we were at a friend's house, a Filipino friend's house, and we were having lunch. And the family invited us to stay over, and they were frying fish, and the fish had a lot of what we call tinik, or the fish bones. And I really wanted to eat it. I wanted to eat with my hands, and to dip it in the patis, and to eat with the rice. And my mom was like, no, you can't eat that. That's only for real Filipinos. And I looked at her and I was like, hey. And she was like, oh, right, you were born in the Philippines. Okay, fine, you can have some. And I know she didn't mean anything by it, but it was one of those little things where somebody makes a kind of a comment to you, and all of a sudden you're just like, great, I'm not a real Filipino. So I'm not American enough, I'm not Asian enough, I'm not Filipino enough, but I'm also too Asian, too Filipino, and too American to everyone. So basically, what I learned was I was too much or never enough. And that's why I call it my too much, not enough phase. I tried really hard to be the right kind of Asian, and I tried really hard to live up to the model minority myth before I even realized what the model minority myth was. Growing up, I did a lot of stereotypically Asian things. Like, for instance, I was trained to be a competitive pianist. I spoke two languages fluently. For some reason, a lot of Americans think that Asians only speak one language and that we don't speak English very well, which is annoying even for me. My mom told me that before I could go to American public school, they insisted that I take the English fluency test because I was an immigrant. And my mom was like, why? She's clearly speaking English with you. But they insisted. So she took me to go see this, I guess, fluency test person. I don't even know what they're called. But I went to go take this test, and I went into the room, took the test, and the person walked out with me, looked at my mom and said, I have no idea why we're testing her. She speaks fluent English. Her English is fine. And my mom was like, thank you. I just wanted to prove that my child can speak English. So I was bilingual. I was active in school to a degree. I did school plays. I was in the drama club. I did some sports. I played soccer. I was in the choir. I was basically Laura Jean Covey from To All the Boys I Loved Before, minus the straight A's and the hot lacrosse playing boyfriend. So yeah, that's how I like to describe myself. But side note, the fact that I can even reference an Asian American character in a teen rom-com today is a big deal to me, because I did not have that when I was growing up. I didn't have any Asian American role models to look up to in the media. So the fact that I can even pull that as a reference today is kind of exciting to me. And I did that on purpose. So yeah, there were a lot of things that I tried to do to be that model minority, but then there were a lot of things that I did that made me stick out and fail as a model minority. Like, I was not quiet. I was really incredibly outspoken. I was very loud. I wasn't really obedient without question. I challenged authority, especially in the church. Not so much school, because I didn't really care about school. I was an average student. That being said, I did get D's and C's, so I wasn't a straight A student. And I also quit piano at the age of 15, which was like the most traumatizing experience of my life at that point, but that's like a whole other story. I also became an artist. Another way that I didn't quite fit into this model minority construct is that I didn't come from a two-parent home at first. Like I said, I was raised by my mom, who was by herself, and up until that point, I was only raised by my dad. So for about half my life, up until I was 9, and half of my life until I graduated from high school, I was raised by single parents. And according to the model minority myth, Asians, the reason why they're so successful and hardworking and everything is because they supposedly come from two-parent stable homes. But I did not. I also didn't come from an upper middle class family, which is supposedly something else that a lot of Asian Americans are, according to this model minority myth, is that we come from wealthy homes. After immigrating, my father, like a lot of immigrants, had a hard time finding work. Even though he has 2 bachelor degrees, he tried to get a third bachelor's degree in America because he thought that having a degree, an American degree, would help him find work easily, but it didn't. He has a career now, but at the time it was really hard for us. And I also in high school went to a wealthy private Christian school, and I was surrounded by a lot of upper middle class people. And I was very, very aware of the fact that I was not wealthy at all. So those were some ways that I felt as if I didn't quite fit into this much larger construct that we call the model minority myth, which really, if you think about it, has a lot of unrealistic expectations, because that's what it's made to do. It's made to give you these unrealistic stereotypes. So I keep talking about this model minority myth. I keep referencing it. And I've been referencing it a lot over the last few weeks. And something that I realize now is that not a lot of people actually understand what the model minority myth is. Well, the model minority myth, unlike the term Asian American, which was created by Asians for Asians, was created by a white man. So the term model minority also came out of the civil rights movement. It was coined by a sociologist who was a professor at UC Berkeley in 1966 when he wrote an article for the New York Times magazine. And this article that he wrote helped popularize comparisons between Japanese Americans and African Americans. And I'm going to read a portion of that article now. In it, he says, asked which of the country's ethnic minorities has been subjected to the most discrimination and the worst injustices, very few people would even think of answering the Japanese Americans. Yet, if the question refers to persons alive today, that may very well be the correct reply. Like the Negroes, the Japanese have been the object of color prejudice. When new opportunities, even equal opportunities are opened up, the minority's reaction to them is likely to be negative, either self-defeating apathy or a hatred so all-consuming as to be self-destructive. For the well-meaning programs and countless scholarly studies now focused on the Negro, we barely know how to repair the damage that the slave traders started. The history of Japanese Americans, however, challenges every such generalization about ethnic minorities. So basically the argument was, if Japanese Americans can be successful in spite of all of this racism that we've thrown at them, why can't the Black people? And this wasn't just something that he did to pit us against African Americans. The model minority myth eventually also created this racial wedge between Asian Americans, not just Japanese Americans, but it eventually spread into Asian Americans and pitted us against other racial minorities in America. So whenever you hear about it, that's what we're referring to. Some of the characteristics that you've probably heard, but didn't realize were part of the model minority myth is all Asian Americans come from wealthy homes. We are all obedient. We are all submissive. We are all smart. We are all successful. We're straight A students. We're engineers, really good at math, all of this stuff. We're apolitical. We don't have opinions. We keep to ourselves and we don't start trouble. That's the model minority myth. So if you've ever looked at an Asian and thought that's who we are, just know that you're subscribing to the model minority myth. One of the things that's really damaging about the model minority myth in particular is that it doesn't address all of the disparities within the Asian American community as a whole. One of those disparities has to do with the wealth gap in Asian America. So all of the statistics that I'm about to quote to you are from the book The Making of Asian America by Erika. So in this book, they break down the wealth gap in Asian America. It says the US Census data confirms that Asian Americans are overrepresented on both ends of the educational and socioeconomic spectrum of poverty, privilege and poverty. More Asian Americans, 49%, have college degrees compared with all other US adults. However, it includes highly educated immigrants who arrive in the US and with advanced degrees, and also individuals whose families have been in the States for generations. However, at the same time, 5 times as many Asians as non-Hispanic whites had 0 to 4 years of education in the year 2000. So by 2010, a greater proportion of the Asian American population, that's 8%, still had less than a 9th grade education than the total US population, and that was 6%. So only 6% of the US population overall had less than a 9th grade education, but 8% of the Asian American population had less than a 9th grade education. And this affects groups especially that are coming from countries with uneven educational opportunities, such as refugees who have lacked access to formal education in refugee camps. And so when they come to America and go to school, the transition can be really challenging and the dropout rates are really high. In the 2010 census, it said Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans have higher median annual personal earnings than the general US population. However, Korean Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and Filipino Americans have lower median annual personal earnings than the US general population. So overall, Asians are represented on both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And for some communities, for some Asian American communities, Chinese Americans are represented, like Chinese Americans, they're represented on both ends. So Chinese Americans can be both extremely wealthy and also be at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum of Asian Americans. So I'm going to move on because I want to make sure I get all of my points in. So those are some ways that the model minority myth has been incredibly damaging to the Asian American community as a whole. And there are a lot of ways that it has pitted us against other communities of color throughout America. Now, I do want to acknowledge, because I think it's important to acknowledge that not all Asian Americans fought the stereotype. One of the things that as a community we are trying to reckon with right now and trying to examine is the history of anti-Blackness in our communities. And the thing is that it's a really complicated topic to address. And I'm not going to say that we're blameless, but like a lot of things concerning race and identity, that can be really complicated, especially when we talk about the history of anti-Blackness in Asian communities, because that can be directly tied to the history of Western colonization. I can't speak for all Asians, but I know for me as a Filipino, that history of anti-Blackness can be directly tied to the history of the Spanish in the Philippines. Specifically, so a lot of people don't know this, but when the Spanish arrived in the Philippines, they called indigenous Filipinos negritos because we were actually very, very dark. And I actually just learned this last week when I was having a conversation with a friend, but Indigenous Filipinos have genetic links to Polynesian, Austronesian, like Maori and Aboriginal Australians, and they have genetic ties to Africans. And so when the Spanish arrived, we were very dark. And over time, those color lines have shifted and blurred a little bit because of interracial marriages or rape, because the Spanish treated us abominably. But for us, that's where that history of anti-Blackness comes from. And you'll hear a lot of Filipinos talk about mestizo or morena. I am considered morena because I am actually considered dark in my community. And I was very aware growing up that I was not light-skinned, that I was not mestiza. And so those are the types of topics that are really complicated for us to address, and especially for immigrant communities, because when we immigrate to the United States, we have no idea what we're about to walk into. I talked earlier about how I had 3 major identity crises. So I'm going to talk really quickly about the next 2 that I had. So they're actually tied. So the second identity crisis I had was when I swore my citizenship to America. I was 18, and what a lot of people don't realize is that when you swear your citizenship to the US, you have to denounce your citizenship to your home country. And so when I was 18, I was faced with this really hard decision. Do I swear my citizenship to the US, this country that I've never felt welcomed in, that I've always been a foreigner in, or do I keep my citizenship to a country that I love, but I barely know anymore? And eventually I did choose to swear my citizenship to America, mostly out of obligation for my parents, because we had gone through so much at that point. I felt like it would be a slap in the face if I said no. And also there was slight fear as well, because I was afraid that if I didn't, I would eventually get deported, as is the fear of most immigrants. My third identity crisis happened shortly afterwards when I finally did go back home to the Philippines. I was 30. I hadn't been to the Philippines in 26 years because I hadn't immigrated. I immigrated when I was 4. And so I think I had this like really idealistic concept, this notion that once I stepped foot on my homeland, that I was going to be imbued with the magic of my ancestors. And I was going to be like, yes, this is exactly where I belong. And I look like everybody. And this is perfect. I'm not different. I'm not foreign. This is amazing. And that is so not what happened. I went to the Philippines, saw my family, was surrounded by Filipinos, and I was still the foreigner. And if I thought that it was isolating to grow up in America foreign because I looked and acted different from everybody else, I felt even more like a foreigner in the Philippines because I looked like everyone else and somehow I still stuck out. So yeah, that was when my third identity crisis started. Ironically, though, I learned more about American history going home to the Philippines than I ever did in America. It was actually in the Philippines. I went on several historic tours, and I learned a lot about stuff that the Americans never taught me. For starters, I learned a lot about World War II and what really happened in the Philippines during World War II. So in America, all I ever learned about with World War II was MacArthur's famous line, "I shall return," and also the Bataan Death March. In the Philippines, I learned that MacArthur and the American troops bombed Manila. I learned that one of the biggest reasons why Manila is now steeped in poverty and a lot of the historic buildings are in ruins is because of the Americans' decision to open fire and heavy artillery on Manila in order to chase the Japanese out. Not to say that the Japanese didn't do anything. The Japanese were brutal as well to the Filipinos, but I learned in the Philippines that a lot of Filipinos actually blame the Americans for the absolute destruction and poverty that is now in Manila. And I'm learning all of this and I'm getting more and more angry because I feel like I was lied to. And one of the most empowering things that I ever saw in my life to this day was this short Filipino man doing this tour. He was so entertaining. He was so funny. He fed us, he gave us food after the tour. But in the middle of the tour, there was a really somber moment, and he very unapologetically looked at all of the white tourists, pointed his finger at them, and he said, "I see the way you look at my country when you come here. I see the way you pass judgment on my people and on the poverty. I see how you look at the ruins. I look at how you judge us. And I just want you all to know that this is because of you. You did this." And I remember sitting there watching that like, whoa, this person just called out a bunch of white people. And it was so empowering for me. But when I returned to the States, I was really, really bitter and I was really angry. And I had no idea what to do with this identity that I had anymore. And for the first time in my life, I actually felt homeless, but not in the way that we normally think about it. I felt homeless because I really did legitimately feel like I didn't have a home. I did not feel Filipino or American, and I had no idea what to do with that. And the way that I coped with this anger and this sense of loss was to dive into research. I started trying to learn as much as I could. And so that's why I say I didn't start learning really about Asian American history until I was 30. So I'm 36. I've only been doing this for 6 years. One of the things that I learned about in my research was something called racial triangulation theory. And I want to share this because I think this is really important. The racial triangulation theory of Asians and Asian Americans proposes that Asians are both simultaneously praised as smart, successful, wealthy next to white, while also being vilified as dirty, foreign, savage, national threats, much like what's happening right now with COVID-19. So this actually works to complement the model minority construct, and it happens in two ways. So the first way is relative valorization. I'm going to read directly from this essay, whereby dominant group A, whites, valorizes subordinate group B, Asian Americans, relative to subordinate group C, Blacks, on cultural and or racial grounds in order to dominate both groups, but especially the latter. So basically, white people praise Asians so that they can compare us to Black people based on culture or race or both in a way to dominate or oppress both of us, but mostly Black people. The other way that racial triangulation works is through civic ostracism, whereby dominant group A, whites, constructs subordinate group B, Asian Americans, as immutably foreign and unassimilable with whites on cultural and or racial grounds in order to ostracize them from the body politic and civic membership. So basically, white people are calling us perpetually foreign, and that we are not able to assimilate based on race or culture or both. And this is a means to keep us out of politics so that we don't feel the sense of civic duty, which if you look at the historic numbers of voting amongst Asian Americans, they are historically pretty low. Up until 2020, those numbers spiked. So this racial triangulation theory, it works to divide Asians, but not just from white and Black people, but also from each other. The processes of relative valorization and civic ostracism are joined analytically by an essentialized reading of Asian American and Asian culture that commits a double elision among Asian American subgroups on one hand, and between Asian Americans and Asians on the other. So it works to divide us, not just from white people, not just from Black people and other racial minorities, but from one another. And that's exactly the kind of explanation that I needed growing up as a 1.5 generation immigrant, because I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. And I especially didn't feel as if I belonged with other Asians because I was an American. This is pretty much the tactic of white supremacy, right? It works to keep us separated from one another and also pits us against each other. The racial triangulation theory also proposes that culture, the term culture over time, has replaced the concept of race within America as a means to separate and to discriminate. Because once it became unacceptable to be racist, they just replaced racism with culture. So anytime you see people comparing racial minorities to one another based on culture, just know really what they're talking about is race. Culture is conceived not as something intrinsically fluid, changing, unstable, and dynamic, but as a fixed property of social groups. Asian Americans are seen as, once again, successful, wealthy, keep our heads down, all of these things. And Black people are seen as the complete opposite. And that is white supremacy at work through racial triangulation and also through the model minority construct. And we see this happening today with COVID-19 scapegoating and also through education. So in August of 2020, a Syracuse University professor was put on administrative leave because he had written the words Wuhan flu and Chinese Communist Party flu in his syllabus notes, and students complained. But then also just 4 months later, in December 2020, a Washington state school district reclassified Asian students as white removing them from their students of color category when data showed that they were doing too well academically. So here we have civic ostracism. You know, we created this pandemic, and it's your fault that this pandemic has spread. But then you also have us being praised as well, because now we're doing so well. Now we're next to white. I sometimes wonder what my reality and what my upbringing, how my sense of self might have been affected had the education system included more Asian American history in our curricula. Liz Kleinrock, who's an Asian American anti-bias, anti-racist educator and a sixth grade teacher, you can follow her on Instagram at Teach and Transform. She posts a lot of really valuable resources and information. She gave her students a questionnaire after the Atlanta shooting to see how much they knew about Asian American history. Out of 52 students, 37 students, which is 70% of her class, disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, "I am knowledgeable about Asian American history." And only 4 students said that they could actually name Asian Americans in history or in modern day culture. To the question, what do you think you know about Asian American history, identities, or experiences? Only 60% of them replied, "I don't know," or nothing. And then when she asked them, what questions do you have about Asian American history or identity? A lot of them had some really uplifting things to say. They said, well, some of the questions that I have are almost everything because I have not been educated on this topic yet, but I hope to one day be. One student said, well, I know nothing, so I guess it would be helpful to know more about everything. And then another person said, I just want to learn more because we don't learn about it in school. A lot of my friends have said to me that they didn't know a lot about Asian American history until they were adults too. I had one friend tell me that she didn't even learn about Japanese internment until she was in her 20s and read a book about Japanese internment, and she was shocked that that had happened. There's a lot of talk right now about how we can address anti-racism and specifically anti-Asian hate in America right now. And one of the things that I've heard repeatedly is we have to start talking and highlighting ways that Asian Americans have worked in solidarity with Black people. And I 100% agree. I really think that we should be talking about how we have worked together in solidarity. And the way that we need to do that and the way that that starts is through education. We have to start teaching our kids about what really happened in American history. And if you teach your kids, if we teach students about Asian American history, then we also reach their parents. And we give that information to their parents as well. If we put it into the curricula to talk about anti-Asian hate, to talk about oppression, to talk about white supremacy, to talk about how racism shows up in systemic oppression, then it's easier for teachers to address those hard topics. But right now, the burden is completely on teachers without any support to address really hard topics like what happened in Atlanta. We need to start teaching our students about times in history that anti-Asian hate and violence has shown up, like 9/11. In the months after 9/11, the FBI reported that hate crimes directed towards Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Americans increased by 1,600%. World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans following Pearl Harbor. We need to start talking about the fact that Pearl Harbor was not the motivation behind Japanese internment. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that the internment was actually supported very heavily by white farmers because of rivalries happening between white Americans and Japanese Americans at the time. There was a Washington Post article that came out in the 90s that addresses this. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but one of the farmers even admitted that that was one of the motivations. Hours after Pearl Harbor happened, they went to Congress, complained that they were basically created this false narrative that they were terrified that Japanese American farmers were going to let the traders in, or were traders and they were going to let the Japanese in, and that they were afraid for their safety. And even though security advisors to the president said that there was absolutely no evidence supporting that Japanese Americans were a threat to national security, they insisted, and that's when Japanese internment happened. One of those farmers, Austin Anson, unabashedly admitted that was one of their motivations. And he was quoted saying, "We're charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We might as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man. They came into this valley to work and they stay to take over." There are so many instances in Asian American history where anti-Asian racism and sentiments have shown up. And we really need to start talking about that. So I really just want to end this with a call to action. The first is, if you are an ally, if you consider yourself an ally to the Asian American community, you can start advocating for things like education reform. Start advocating for Asians to be included in the education curricula and also in discussions regarding anti-racism. And the second call to action is, we really need cross-community solidarity. We really need to start talking about ways that Asian Americans and Black people and Latinx people all show up for one another, because that's not something that's included in the history books, and we rarely get to talk about that. And really what we need right now also in that cross-community solidarity is, we need our allies to let us be angry, because we are so angry right now. And we need our allies to give us that space to be angry and not tell us, hey, maybe you should calm down. And to my Asian American community members, I'm here to try and give you permission. I want you to feel empowered to feel angry, because that's what we need right now in our community. I went to a vigil in Baltimore the other day, and I'll end with this story. I went to a vigil in Baltimore to honor the Atlanta shooter, the victims of the Atlanta shooting. And my friend, Yun B, who's a musician here in Baltimore, they went up and they said, look, I'm really angry right now, and I want all of us to feel that anger too. And then they invited the entire group, the entire block of people, to just scream with them in anger. And they counted us in, and you had a whole group of people for one whole block just screaming their anger. And everyone just felt so invigorated and empowered. And they said, that's what I want you to feel. I want us to feel anger. Yes, we can be sad. Yes, we can be frustrated. Yes, we can be exhausted. But I want us to be angry. And that's what we need to carry with us when we go to these marches, when we call for advocacy, when we call for allyship, when we call for reform. That's what we need. And we need to find a way to sustain the movement past this anger. But that's what we need right now. So thank you so much for listening and for coming here. There's so many things that I wanted to address, but we have a Q&A. So yeah, thank you so much.
So first off, I just have to, because you know, the Alicia Keys song, this girl is on fire. I was just this whole talk, I'm like, this woman is on fire. So thank you. And I just really love the way you tell your story and weave so much history, social and political history into it as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me get to the questions before I keep going on with the phrases, but yes.
I was trying to keep track of time, and I was like, oh no, I'm running out of time.
And it's so true about that anger. You know, respectability politics will keep you like, okay, let me find a very good way to say this. And sometimes you can't say it cute. You can't say it pretty. You got to say how it hurts. You got to say how it feels. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm coming back now. So one of the first questions we have, Cori, is, hi, Cori, thank you for this. Language-oriented questions, no shade attached. You refer to America as in you immigrated to America when you were 4. Would you be open to naming the United States or something else rather than saying America, as it unconsciously invisibilizes Central and South America?
Yeah, no, totally. I 100% agree with that. I was trying really hard to say the Americas. I usually refer to it as the States or the United States. But yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. Because, and a friend of mine who's Panamanian, he pointed that out to me when I said, I'm from America. And he was like, well, I am too. And I was like, oh, that's a really good point. So I usually try to say States or United States. So I apologize if I was saying America throughout. That was not what I was trying to do, but that's a really good point.
Thank you. Another question in terms of you addressing colorism. So how do you address colorism within your community?
That's tough, right? I think it depends on who you're talking to. I've had this conversation a lot with other Asian Americans. It's really hard to talk about race. I think one of the things that we have to address is how privilege shows up in our community because it's not evenly distributed, as I was trying to explain with the model minority myth. Because of colorism, because of white supremacy, right? Um, that privilege shows up very differently. So within my own community, I'm considered morena. I'm dark skinned. There are some disadvantages that come with that, right? You learn growing up that what's ideal is light skin. So mestiza usually refers to people who have a little bit more of an East Asian look to them in the Philippines, or who are just straight up half white, half Filipino. Um, One of my biggest frustrations, and I'm just going to call out my community here, is when I see light skinned or East Asian or white passing Asians uh, try to call me out on my privilege, assuming that my privilege is the same. And my friends know this. I've gotten into some arguments with people on Facebook over that because I'm just like, listen, you have to check yourself because your privilege is not the same. So I always tell people like, check your privilege, but also check your trauma and realize that the trauma that you experienced, even though we're a part of this community, right? It doesn't show up the same. And a lot of times privilege and trauma, what I've realized, they tend to be linked, right? How much privilege you have, how much trauma you've experienced. They're very closely tied. So yeah, I think it's really difficult. I officially stay away from Facebook because that is not the way to talk about race and colorism. It's very hard. But usually, for me anyway, when I have conversations, especially like public panels, I find that usually people are open to those discussions. I'm also just really unapologetic. I'll just call you out. I'll just be like, listen, you need to sit because your privilege is showing. So, but that's me.
Another question too, being where you are now in this space at a Research One institution, a predominantly white space, and being able to name white supremacy. So the question is, what does it feel like to be able to name white supremacy in this space?
It feels really good. That's why I was telling the story about the tour guide who called that out, because for me, that was a really empowering moment to see another brown Filipino call out white supremacy. I think it's something that we need to address. I had this in my original speech and I wasn't able to get to it, but I've I've been asked several times, why is everything about race with you? And I sort of roll my eyes at that question because the answer to that is because everything is about race. And it's not just in America. Look at the history of the world. The entire world at this point is suffering because of white supremacy and systemic injustice, and specifically systemic racism. We have had entire civilizations wiped out because of white supremacy and systemic racism. And so for anyone to assume that there are some things, especially when we talk about identity and prejudice and all of that, and oppression, to assume that it's not about race, that's really ignorant. It is about race. And the sooner, if we can actually address that, if we're able to acknowledge that and name that and realize that a lot of our problems in a systemically racist environments, which at this point, pretty much every nation of this world suffers from that. If we can just address for once that everything is unfortunately about race, because you can't have a systemically racist system or government without it, then we can start working together to dismantle that, right? But, to the people who have asked me, why is everything about race to you? The answer is because it is about race. It's 100% about race, not just in the States, in the whole world.
I hear you. I hear you. And as my Quaker background says, friend speaks my mind. All right, I'm going to move to the question. What action items do you suggest Asian Americans act on or ask our elected officials to act on at this time?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the things that I mentioned was we need to call for education reform. I know a lot of Asian American activists that are definitely advocating for that. And actually, Mayor Scott, I have a lot of respect for him. He's doing a lot of really great things, and he hasn't even been in office that long, but he actually called a meeting for some Asian American community leaders last week and just opened the floor to us and listened to us and asked us, what do you need? And that was one of the things that we had proposed. A couple of people said we need to highlight Asian and Black solidarity in the history of Baltimore. And I said, yeah, we also need education reform. And I'm not talking about waiting for Congress to pass anything, because we all know how long it takes for them to do anything. I'm talking about going to your local elected officials and demanding education reform. You can do that within your school districts. You can demand that. And I know a lot of teachers right now that are taking that effort upon themselves to address those topics outside of the curriculum with their students. And so, props to teachers right now, because they're going through it. And I see you all, and I have so much respect for you as someone who has worked in the public school system. So
Yes, I hear you. I heard a teacher who presented to our civic sessions the other day who said she had to do something on a sneak to do culturally responsive and relevant teaching. And I'm like,
yeah.
Next question. I thought it's not a good idea to label people or groups, yet there are more and more labels or identity group names coming out to address differences and preferences. So is it good to label or group people for a sense of identity?
I think the important thing to realize for me, and this is my perspective, when it comes to identity, identity is really complicated, right? Like, my husband is mixed, my cousins are mixed. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with my cousin, because growing up in America, everything was black or white, right? So everything was black or white or Asian for me. Like, everything was like, you're black, you're white, or maybe you're Filipino. And I labeled my cousins, who are half Filipino, half Scottish, I labeled them my white cousins. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I had this conversation with my cousin Steven, and he was like, "See, you call us your white cousins, Cori, but in Scotland, we are not white, because white is white over there. Like, we are something else." And that was the first time that it occurred to me that maybe identity is a little bit more complicated. And, even race is complicated, right? Because it's made up. So it's complicated. But identity is really complicated, right? I said this the other day, you can be a member of a racially marginalized group or a marginalized community and still be white or white passing, right? Like, you can be Asian and white, and that's complicated, right? Because you're mixed. And so identity is super, super complicated. And for me, that's why I just put all of the descriptors. I am Filipino, I am Asian, I am immigrant, I am an American, I am a woman, I am straight, I am cisgender, all of those things. I think they're all valid, right? Because I think what happens, especially in America, is that we tend to think that identity is an either or. Therefore, race and racism is an either or. But usually it's, and I read this in an article the other day, usually it's a both and, right? You are both this and that. And it doesn't have to exist in a vacuum. So for me, I think with labels, yeah, they can be dangerous, but I think the important thing to acknowledge is just to acknowledge that identity in and of itself is super complicated, and there's no way around that, which is why racism is really shallow for a lot of reasons, because of how complex identity can be.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We have another question. I am a high school math teacher in Baltimore City and have a couple questions related to education. Do you have any recommendation on how schools with small Asian American populations can support AAPI students and have these conversations without making them feel like they're being put in the spotlight? I'll ask the next one after that.
Yeah. To be completely honest, I think just talking about Asian American history, I don't think that there's any reason why an Asian American would feel like they're being put on the spotlight unless you specifically looked at them and asked them to input their opinion. I think just talking about it helps, because if we don't talk about it, then they're always going to feel ostracized and they're always going to feel left out, right? I would have done anything for a teacher to just talk about it, and I don't think I would have felt obligated to talk about my identity as an Asian. I don't even know if people would have labeled me as Asian growing up, because there was so little conversation around what it meant to be Asian. So I think, you can talk about these things without necessarily putting a student on the spot, right? Like, don't ask them for their opinion, but if you open the floor to everyone and say, does anyone have any thoughts? That just gives them the power and the responsibility to ask questions, right? Because I think they're all processing a lot of things too. So I think even just addressing it and talking about it really helps. And I don't think that that's going to make them feel like they're put on the spot.
Absolutely. Avoiding tokenizing, but definitely education. As I'm preparing my AP statistics course for next year, I'm incorporating data on racial discrimination and want to make sure that mistreatment of Asian Americans is represented as well. Are there any sources that you recommend for gathering this type of data?
For anti-Asian discrimination? Is that the question?
Yes.
Actually, yes. Hold on, let me pull up my notes here because I just ran into this book not too long ago. And I have to get it. I have to order it. It's called where is it? It's called Anti-Asian Violence in North America. And I was actually going to talk about it, but then I ran out of time, so that's fine. But yeah, it's anti-Asian violence in North America, and it's actually a really comprehensive study of violence that's been enacted towards Asian Americans throughout history, specifically in the United States and Canada, is what the book focuses on. So I would start there. Also, I would go to websites like stopaapi.org. They're collecting data right now about anti-Asian hate crimes that have been happening throughout the United States since the beginning of the pandemic. I know a lot of Asian Americans are afraid or don't report to the police for very good reasons, very valid reasons, I should say. But stopaapi.org is doing their best to collect that data, even if Asians won't go to the police to report.
All right. Another question. I worry about peers asking them a lot of questions and making them feel uncomfortable as though they have to speak for all Asian Americans. So I guess
Sorry, what was it again?
It was a statement more than a question. So
Oh, okay.
that question was, I worry more about their peers asking them lots of questions, making them feel uncomfortable, whereas they have to speak for all Asian Americans.
Yeah, so I guess they're asking how to have that conversation without, I guess, making them feel on the spot. I think it's the same thing, right? I think if you just talk about it, I really like what what Liz Kleinrock did. Again, you can follow her. I suggest everybody follow her on Instagram. She goes by Teach and Transform, at Teach and Transform. She's done a TED Talk on education reform. She works heavily with anti-racism, anti-bias, or anti-bias, anti-racism work. And she did a survey with her students to gauge how much they actually knew about Asian American history and identity. And that really opened up the floor. I think that something like that can open the floor for your students to have those conversations. You know, I think it's important though, whenever you do decide to have these kinds of conversations with your students as a whole, is that you don't walk in with the expectation that the Asian students are going to have something to say, because the truth of the matter is that a lot of them are still processing. I couldn't have put into words the way I do now what I was experiencing growing up, because I didn't know what was happening, right? And I didn't have those resources to be able to ask those questions and process those struggles that I was having. So I think just allowing them the space to even think and giving them the opportunity to ask those questions for themselves, I think that's helpful in and of itself. So I think, yeah, just walk in without that expectation that they will have something to say.
And last question, in terms of your profession, teaching theater and also being an actress, how can you use, or how do you use your profession as a form of advocacy for AAPI community?
Things like this, if they pop up, I feel very honored when people ask me to do things like this. So thank you again for giving me this platform. I think also too, you know, one of the things that I got involved with last year was I got involved with the Unapologetically Asian team. And that was a group of artists. That was a group of Broadway actors and television actors and people in marketing. And we all felt the same way. I think for us, knowing that we have this platform and that we work so closely with the topic of representation and identity as actors, that gives us this really unique insight into how that works, right? And especially when it comes to representation, because of the scarcity of roles available to Asians right now, and how representation or the lack thereof impacts an entire community. I think for me as an actor, I don't know if it's so much that it just gives me a little bit more confidence to speak in front of people, but for me, I've started to realize that I just want to tell stories that matter to me. That's why I started my LLC, my acting studio, because I started to realize that as an immigrant actor, I really struggled with trying to find my identity. There's a quote by someone named Uta Hagen who says that in order to become a really good actor, you have to first know who you are, and then you incorporate parts of yourself into your work as an actor. And I thought it was so profound when I was younger. And then now that I'm an adult, I realize how loaded that concept is when you're a person of color and when you're an immigrant actor, because knowing yourself, even if you know who you are, nobody wants to know who you are. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. Nobody wants to hear your actual story. They'd rather put you in a box. So knowing who you are and trying to incorporate that into your performance and your career as an actor is really loaded and really weighted. And so, you know, for me, I oftentimes find that my work stretches beyond just acting, because what's the point of being an actor if the stories that you're telling have no meaning to you? So I think for me, it has to do with what kinds of stories are we telling, and also realizing that we have the power and the capacity to say, no, I don't want to play that role. It's stereotypical and it offends me. So that's how it works out for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. We have really enjoyed you sharing this history, sharing your story, and being so engaging. And I'm telling you, I was your amen corner over here tonight. Just like, yes, yes, name it. Thank you. So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope that you, like me and like us, have learned so much. And there are resources in the chat that you can click on, that you can save. So if I were you, I would copy the chat and paste it into a separate document, but you'll also be sent these as well. So thank you, everyone. They will be emailed to you all. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your advocacy and your education. And yes, 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 you all can talk to your local school boards. You're not happy what you're seeing in the classroom. You know, education is the practice of freedom. Absolutely. Thank you all. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.